Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we're going to be discussing chapter 33, the end of Napoleon. So let's get started. So let's look at his overall path to his fall. As we last left off with Napoleon, he had tried to capture and battle England, Great Britain, and he was unsuccessful. He was no match for their navy. And so he was still upset about this, but he set his focus on Europe. Now, England was not going to let him win. So England partnered up with the countries Prussia, Russia, and Austria and said, let's work together. Let's go and make sure that he does not win and take over Europe because he is land hungry. And they agreed and they were working together. They were going to fight him when he came into their areas. But Napoleon's army was no match for their country's armies. And so he was easily able to push the Austrians back into Vienna, their capital, out of Italy, as we know. He was able to push a lot of the other countries back and fight them. His first attempt at fighting Russia, he did win. And with this, those three countries decided to just sign peace treaties to say, we won't stand in your way. We'll be loyal to you. Let's end the war. Let's end fighting right now. So with that, Napoleon said, okay, I've mastered Europe. Now I need to get back to Britain. I can't believe they beat me. I must find a way to get to them. And he decided if I can't get them by sea, I will block them from entering Europe's mainland because most of the countries in Europe either depended on France for support or for products. And the other group of European countries had promised with treaties to not get in his way and to not be a problem for him. So with the rest of them, they agreed to his new plan against Britain, which was to not allow any of their ships to stop in Europe. And also, no one was allowed to buy English or British products. And so he was trying to cut them off financially. If Britain couldn't trade with Europe, they would lose lots of money. And he thought he would starve them out until they finally surrendered to Napoleon. That was his plan. But some countries were just like, nah, I'm not going to do this. And one of the big ones was Portugal. Portugal, which is this small little country on the other side of Spain. So France is up here. Spain and Portugal. Portugal really depended on British trade to survive. They wanted British products and they sold products to Britain. And so this kind of plan was not going to be helpful for them. And so they were like, no, I don't care, Napoleon, we're not doing that. And Napoleon said, what do you mean, no? You need to do what I say. And so he was angry and decided he was going to attack Portugal. But to get to Portugal, he had to go through Spain. And so he went through Spain and conquered Spain. He kicked the king off the throne in Spain and he said, check, all done. Now to go to Portugal. But before he could even start to go there, Russia had said, I don't care if we have a treaty. This is ridiculous. No more. And Napoleon said, what do you mean no more? So he had to stop his invasion of Portugal and head straight to Russia, across the continent in June with all of his troops to attack Russia and remind them who was boss. But when he arrived, the Russians weren't there. And so he kept going through towards Moscow. He said, they must be in Moscow. I'm going to go there and find Alexander the First of Russia and attack him. And when he was going, as they were going, they were burning all of the crops on their way. They were setting fire to cities and villages on their way to Moscow. Napoleon was angry. And when he got to Moscow, it was almost empty. He's like, where is everyone? He sent a letter to Alexander and said, if you do not come here and surrender, I am burning Moscow. But no one responded. So he did burn Moscow. And he was waiting in Moscow, and he was like, where is everybody? And no one showed up, and it was finally getting cold. Because, see, Alexander had a plan. He said, Other countries are not prepared for Russian winters. So I will just stay in hiding and I will have people retreat into other places because Russia is so big that they won't be able to find us. And we'll just let the winter destroy Napoleon. And finally it was September and they hadn't heard anything. Napoleon hadn't heard anything from Alexander. And so he was tired of waiting. His troops were getting cold. Snow was going to start falling soon. So he said, okay, we'll head back. So they decided to head back in September. And in September, he was like, I don't care. We're leaving. And as they were leaving to go back, the soldiers were getting so cold because they were wearing their summer uniforms. And there was no food because they had set fire to all of the farms on their way to Moscow. So it was not good conditions and many soldiers were dying. They even had to, some of them, toss their guns because they were too cold to hold. They were freezing and a lot died. And on their way back into Prussia, which is how they entered, they had to cross a bridge to get there. But while they were in Moscow, the Russians went and burned that bridge. So the only way now to get out of Russia, they had to go through the freezing cold waters into Prussia, which they did. And it made a lot of people sick and they died. So Napoleon headed back to France, greatly weakened. The real winner of that was Russia and their strategy of letting the cold destroy Napoleon. Now, this was all happening in Europe, but there was something happening across the pond in America, and that was known as the War of 1812. So, changing topics a little bit to what was happening in America, America had lots of problems with Britain. There was lots of little annoyances and problems that were building, and finally, they had had enough. They were done with Britain. One of the things that they had a problem with was that a lot of British sea ships were capturing American ships and taking British people and bringing them back to England and Great Britain to serve in the Royal Navy against Napoleon's troops because they needed more men. And some of these people were British people that they were taking off the ships. Some British people worked on American ships. Some British people pretended to be Americans because they didn't want to go and fight. And the British claimed when they took these American ships, we're looking for those British people who are avoiding going into the war and we're capturing them. But they were also capturing Americans. They weren't checking very well. And Americans were outraged by this. How dare you take us and force us into your boats and your army? Additionally, the Americans were upset because they thought that Britain was encouraging and helping the Native Americans who were currently against the United States. A lot of Native Americans, especially in the Ohio area, they were very just upset that the Americans kept going in and taking their land. And they kept going in and taking their land. And finally, Native Americans, a lot of them had enough, and they were starting to fight back. Now, with all of this anger and aggression from the Native Americans and their fighting against the Americans, the U.S. thought the British were helping and supplying weapons to these Native Americans through Canada. And they were. So America was very angry with really angry with Britain, and they decided that they were going to declare war against them. We declare war, sincerely, USA. And as this war was declared, Britain sent lots of Navy ships to the Great Lakes in the North Ohio region, and there they did join Native American forces, led primarily by this man called Tecumseh. And Tecumseh was a big leader of the Native American forces, and he was from the Shawnee tribe. Now, with Tecumseh and the Shawnee tribe and the other Native Americans that were allied in helping with the British, they were able to capture cities like Detroit and make some progress, but eventually there was just too many American soldiers and they were outnumbered. So they ended up losing in that Ohio area. Then later, Great Britain decided to come to Washington, D.C., the capital, and just set it on fire. They set the Capitol building on fire, the Library of Congress on fire, and they were making a big statement against America. Now, all of this was happening while the Napoleon stuff was happening, and Britain was just too busy with the Napoleon stuff. And so they said, let's have a treaty. Let's just stop this. And America had their whole Capitol building burned down, lots of chaos. And they're like, yeah, let's just stop fighting. And so no land was gained or lost. No one won or lost. They just ended the war. So that was the War of 1812 happening in America. But back to Europe. In Europe, finally, Napoleon reached back to France after losing in Russia. And he was really weak now. So Great Britain encouraged his 3 allies before, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. He said, guys, he's weak. This is the time to attack. So they did. While Napoleon was not home, Great Britain and his allied forces invaded France, and they went to Paris to try and capture it. Napoleon returned quickly, and he was going to stop the allied forces, but they had already captured Paris. And so Napoleon was forced to surrender his throne. In part of his surrendering his throne, he was sent to exile on the small island of Elba off the coast of France. But he found that life boring, and he had heard news of what was happening in France. You see, when he left, they needed a new leader. So the French government had decided to ask the relative of our last king, who died on the guillotine. They asked him to come and be king of France. And so he did come. His name was Louis the 17th, and he came. And when he came, he wanted to be treated just like the kings of old. He wanted to be treated like his older family members had been treated. And the citizens were not ready to go back to those old days of monarchy. And so citizens were a little about them. Napoleon again was bored, and he had heard what was happening in France. So he snuck out of Elba's island, and he snuck on a boat and ended up in southern France. There, when he arrived, he said, "I've come to set you free," like he has said so many times before. And the citizens, who were not really happy with their new king, said, "Woohoo! Yay! Awesome!" And they supported him. Even soldiers who were sent to stop him ended up just joining him. And he marched his way with all of his supporters to Paris, and he took back his throne, and the king had fled. So now Napoleon had returned to be the emperor of France. Now, Great Britain heard about this. They said, "What? He's escaped? He's emperor again? Absolutely not." So he gathered his troops and he went to Belgium, north of France, to start his attack. And Prussia said, "We will go there to meet you." And so they were fighting on their way to their destinations. And finally, Napoleon met the British troops in the city of Waterloo, which was in Belgium. There they battled, but they were pretty evenly matched. And Napoleon, due to his skilled army strategies, was starting to win. Luckily, Prussia showed up just in time. And Prussia and their troops that they brought were able to join the British forces and destroy Napoleon. Napoleon had been emperor again, but not for very long. As soon as he lost, he went back to France and he wrote a letter saying, "Fine, I'm serious this time. I'll give up my throne." And then he went into hiding. And Britain's like, "Where is he?" So a search began. And finally, Napoleon surrendered to British forces, and they decided to send him to the far, far away island of Saint Helena down in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa. He stayed there for 2 years and then eventually died of illness. And that was the end of Napoleon. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.